pleasure to be here. I came here when they started, when you started, and I'm happy to visit periodically, always with great delight, and to hear the interesting things. I was impressed today by how much research on interactivity is going on here. It really looks like it's an area of core expertise, and I'm delighted to see that. I hope that you do something about that so the whole world just knows how much work on interactivity is being done around here. I'd like to talk today about thinking. I don't think that the general topic of thinking is one that is much thought about in cognitive science. And if you were to ask somebody what is thinking, you often get a rather thin account. I'd like to push that a little push it and broaden the notion of what thinking is to include all sorts of things. In this case, this is dancers doing what's called marking. Marking is a universal practice in dance, and it involves practicing a movement with less energy than the full-out version. No one ever performs like this. It's an imperfect model of the more complete movement that they will perform. Dancers insist that marking helps them think about their movement, and we have experimental proof that they're right. Marking is an instance of a general non-verbal, interactive way people have of thinking about things, and they construct external structures to push thought forward. That's part of what I want to talk about. So if you think for a moment, how is it that we are able to get to the next thought? Where does that come from? How is it that it's made coherent? When it is. But where do they come from? You could just say, oh, it's boiling associations underneath. But that really doesn't give an adequate account of the coherence and the capacity we have for pushing in general directions. And then, of course, there's creativity. All of that is a mystery. So one way that people push thought forward is, at least in the context of reading, they drag their hand. It's called a pacer. And in high-speed reading, it's an obvious example of ways in which people speed up thought. It doesn't work very well, in fact, but people continue to believe it does. And for some people, it does work better. But the idea that you can drag something forward, if you choose well how to drag, is almost irresistible when you're interested in speeding up thought. What I'm going to do today is, among other things, speed up your thought. I'll show you at the end how I know that I've done that. So first I'd like to talk about how we use our eyes to help us think, and then show how we use our hands and how we use our bodies, tools, and possibly nearby objects. There's a good chance I won't get as far as the nearby objects. So, thinking with your eyes. Will this design work? While you look, try to note how you're probing the image. What parts are you looking at? Are you creating partial narratives of use? Running through using it this way or that. Little simulations. This is a form of enhanced action or inactive vision. It's active vision of some sort or inactive vision. All right. I say now, which square will end up, when folded, be in the X position? While you're doing that, you are engaging in some sort of mental simulation with the visual system. So, what's that? Isn't that thinking? Well, if you accept that it's thinking, and you accept that it's very nonverbal, then at a minimum we have a good example of nonverbal thinking. I don't think there are many people in the world today who would deny that there is nonverbal thinking. One of the things I'd like to just bring to your attention, I don't believe I have to be introducing it, just bring your attention to, is that we engage all our modalities to think, so we can think in different modalities. We get benefits by moving between modalities, and then once we can think in different modalities, we can also think with things nearby, tools, and all sorts of things. So that's the thought that I want to push forward, and basically, just as we saw some thinking involves mental simulation while looking, in general, I'm going to be speaking, my talk will be a long riff on that basic idea. that mental simulation while looking or moving or doing something is something that we do, and it's an interactive activity which enables us to push thought forward. So projection is another element of visual thinking. I say, well, can you move 11 to where the 15 is? You know the game of 8 here. So first you find the 11 and the 15, which I made a little more bold to make you find them quickly. And then you know how you have to do it. So we show you, and when you do it, although your image may not exactly have been like what you just saw, there was some sort of replacement effect that you engaged in. Well, that visual process of augmenting the image, the visual image, is not the same as imagination or mental imagery, because in the case of mental imagery, you don't have to locate the mental image on something. Mental images don't have a characteristic size. You can't say, well, just how big is that square I've asked you to think about in your mind? You don't have to locate it, but here it has to be tied down, anchored. So now I say, well, how about moving 1 to 11's position? Can you do the 8 puzzle enough? I'm not going to wait because none of you will succeed. So there's too much complexity there. What happens when you do that? Well, we engage in some kind of project, create, interactive strategy. Well, first you find the 1 and the 11, and then you start to move this down and move that off to the side. And at some point you peter out. So you reach for your hand if you have the item there, and you start moving it. So there's an interactive case where you project as much as you can, and then you manipulate. This, I think, is one of the core interactive strategies that we know of. So thinking often involves making models or simulations through active or inactive perception, projection, and manipulation. Those are 3 distinct things, and the interactive play between them, I think, is what goes to the heart of both thought and interactivity. My agenda. I just introduced some of the main theoretical claims, but I'm about to do them in terms of specific claims. There are going to be 6 of those. In the course of that, I'll talk about thinking through the body and the study of dance making. Then I'll talk about thinking with or through instruments. And if I'm lucky, but I doubt, we'll talk about extending that to ordinary objects. So, main theoretical claims. Thinking is often interactive. Let's explore this a bit further. Let's look at hands. I say, proof. All 3 medians of a triangle always intersect at a single point. Now, at least 70% of you are trying to remember whether a median is the same as a bisection. A median is the one that cuts the line opposite in half. Okay? Will 3 medians of a triangle always intersect? Can you do it in your head? Well, if you try, probably what's going to happen is you first conceive of a triangle. You say, okay, I know what the median is. I know they have to intersect that third one. Does it or doesn't it? So imagination is going to be fallible at that point, and you feel uncomfortable in making about the claim. So if you create an external representation, now there's a whole cost, because I got as far as making the triangle, putting the 2 medians in. I'm loath to do this, but I can't get it, so I'm going to build it. So now I'm externalizing it. It's still too hard after putting in the 2 of them to decide, typically, so I'll actually go and create the third one. Claim 1. So I've been arguing that thinking is often interactive, and that there's a project, create, interactive strategy going on, as shown just there. 2, projection can be in any modality. Okay, look at this cube and look at it and try to feel the boundaries of it. I need you to actually try, if you wouldn't mind, please, because you're actually going to project this way. So looking and using your hands to feel its width, you have to anchor it on the visual. I mean, you could just do this and say, oh, I did it. But if you actually try to get it and you see it's 6 inches, you say, well, it's like that. So I'm sort of saying, okay, 6 inches. That's a kind of kinesthetic projection of trying, that's why you have to move it, to try to get the distance. Now, I could do it as well without making the body movement. And what would that be? That feeling of what it was, that would be kinesthetic imagery. But the hands give you greater precision with that. Would please read this silently. Okay, that was auditory projection onto words. Little auditory images running through your head, regulated. So, that claim was we project in many modalities, kinesthetic modalities, sound modalities, you saw vision before. If you're good, you can do gustatory. If you're a cook, you may also be able to do olfactory. Or if you're an enophile and you love wine and you've learned 415 different scents, you may be able to do that. 3, we create structure to project onto, and we do that in many modalities. So many of you have seen this before. This is this wonderful mental abacus, where he was not quite an abacus champion, but he was one of the ones who works toward being an abacus champion. And what he was doing mental abacus. Now they're moving so fast in multiplying 7-digit numbers in his head that you can't do it using sound. So what they do is they encode the numbers on the abacus, which you can manipulate. You can see yourself manipulating faster than saying the words 37 times 19. Already it's taken me so long. 7 times 9, 63, carry the 6. Are you kidding? So he did 7-digit numbers. So there was a case where the numbers are encoded visually, and he pushed his manipulation of the abacus simulation faster by moving his hands. Here now is another case of people marking. And I'll be talking about this at length, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But there's a case of they're going to be projecting onto their body activities which are not the full phrase that they really have to work on. Tetris. I haven't talked about Tetris in a very long time, but it seems quite fitting. So you ask, where should this piece go? How do you do it? Well, we knew that physical rotation is faster than mental rotation, because you can rotate at between 80 and 110 milliseconds for a quarter turn. Mental rotation is anywhere from 250 to 450 milliseconds, and the reason there's such a big difference there is partly because of the cost of actually triggering the hand and doing the response. But in addition to the sort of mentally rotation. So the measures are a little awkward. So physical rotation is faster in this context than mental rotation. If you could get to the same mental state by doing the physical performance, that's a good thing. We call those epistemic actions, Paul. Physical rotation also is a good way of revealing different shapes. So the problem was the mirror pieces. The mirror pieces, they are the harder ones you can make more likely to make a mistake on. If you twirl it, you get very confident about which piece you are looking at. So people like to twirl it 2 times at least to see which way it orients, and that gives them an idea which piece it was. So we found that when they were mirror pieces, people tended to twirl them more too, and they would reveal the shape. So now you go to the outside to do the twirling. It's faster than your head. And since you've made your decision about what the piece is, now you're looking for where to place it, or you're actually thinking you're going to place it. I'm just going to verify which piece it is. That's projection. So claim 3. We create structure to project onto, and we create that structure in many modalities. We did the hand, you saw him do hand motion. You could have sound onto which to project, and moving objects. So interim. We think interactively through this projection creates cycle. Thinking often involves building models or making simulations, and that helps us make sense of things by simulating, understanding its possibilities, consequences of it, and to think things through. Whatever that phrase means, think things through. And the idea is that these various external supports help us think things through. you can guess that as society progresses, culture introduces new and more interesting types of mechanisms and tools and cognitive artifacts to work with. We will have new ways to think things through and new kinds of thinking. So, again, this interactive strategy is multimodal. We have this sort of mental imagery projected onto the outside, on gestures, onto body movement, manipulating objects. Writing is another case where you can use saw, and drawing also, we could see that. I didn't show that, but next claim. Interactive thinking requires a tight temporal coupling between internal and external processes. So here's a case where if you were to already have figured out what piece it is, twirling it would be of no epistemic value. So the epistemic worth of the action depends upon where you are in the process of knowing what piece it is. If that is a subproblem, identify piece type, that happens before you figure out where to put it, then you've got to twirl it early enough in that cycle. Not too early, not too late. There's some kind of coordination moment. Now here's another case. This is just wonderful. This is Noah Gelber. He's one of Bill Forsyth's dancers. Well, Bill's just retired. But they must have had an exercise in which they were looking at banquet furniture. And they used that to, they were asked to think through ways in which they could use those resources outside to make a dance movement. And dancers in contemporary do this all the time. What he was doing actually is quite simple, relatively speaking, as an exercise. It's quite simple. So some of the tasks, the choreographic tasks or choreographic problems that dancers rely on to come up with novel movements are more complicated than that, but that's a good one for you to see. Now you could imagine that if there wasn't a tight coupling between what he was imagining happening, and I'm not saying that he was imagining the table like this, visually the table. He was sort of imagining some composite of the feeling of moving the table, working with that object. So it was a kinesthetic thing, but no doubt it had visual components as if he were working with it. If they're off-center, that's not going to work. So that's a tight temporal coupling. So we can expect a tight temporal coupling between internal and external in order to get the most out of some of these interactions. 5, when we externally model, we mentally project to some aspect or dimension of the target thing. It's not just everything. So take the case of a caricature. You look at that. This is to give you the idea of what an aspect is. And I will be talking about this at length now. This is what we're starting to move towards, because I think it's how marking works. So here's a case where somebody's going to sketch it. They take aspects of Winston Churchill, even if they're complicated aspects. So I didn't really prove that to you, but I'm introducing the concept of an aspect there. So those are going to be the start of the main theoretical claims. Now let's look at bodies and dancing. So how do we use our bodies to help us think? So it's sort of fun to talk about, put the word mediated between a lot of these kinds of cognitions or thinking. And now you could say, well, tell me about body-aided mediated thinking, or tool-mediated thinking, or sound-mediated thinking, and so on. And in this case, let me discuss the case study of dance making. So I was fortunate to meet him, Wayne McGregor, who is a choreographer of the Royal Ballet, and he has a contemporary company called Random Dance. He came to UCSD to consider being our first innovator in residence, and he met 25 faculty. We hit it off, and he then brought me up to London to participate in a seminar. We continued to get on well, and he agreed to come to UCSD, bring his dance company, and be the innovator for a few weeks, 3 weeks. Then they started to make a new dance, and I made a class, and we would trot out and study it with lots of video cameras and lots of interviews and so on. And that was the first one. Then I went to London. Then I went to the country, not in London actually, and then again in London for another one. Now the UCSD setup, which is approximately the same setup that I would make in every time that he would create a dance, was we would go out with usually 6 high-definition cameras, focus it on the dance floor. If I had people working with me, they would be sitting taking notes. They would be coding according to some kind of coding method, coding language that we had already used. In the case of UCSD, we were just getting together. I interviewed him before and after. That was when we were just getting together, getting to know each other, so he had a slightly defensive posture and I had a very forward posture. He gave me 25, 22, 23 interviews. He normally gives one interview of 45 minutes, and he gave me 22 of an hour. So we got on very well. We continued to. I'll be working with him for another several years. At UCSD, we would rush and get all the information from the associate choreographer of what happened during the day. And then we would make questions for the students who would take the dancers into another venue where they were videoed, answering the questions, and we tried to get the dancers to dance their answers. The reason was that the problems dancers are solving, or choreographic problems, require that they make decisions as to whether to go this or something much more interesting and complicated than that. And you'd like to know, how did you make these decisions? And you tried it out for a while, and then you just went this way. So that's what we tried to learn a little bit. We would collect a vast amount of data, about 20 terabytes of data for each of these 4 captures so far. Lots of interviews, stills, and so on. Notes from the associate choreographer, and the music used when we could. So now let's look at one of the phenomena. So here's a case where he's practicing. Okay, it's afterward, she's practicing too. And you look at this and you say, well, I know what they're doing, right? Everybody kind of knows what they're doing. On the other hand, how could doing this possibly facilitate performance of the real movement? They are never going to perform anything like that in performance context. So how could that help? So marking is doing in small and without an energy, not full out, the movement in some way. It doesn't have to be very small, but there is such a thing as small marking. And Irish river dancers, you know, who are the ones who stand and go like this, they will actually practice with their fingers. You say, how could you possibly use the wrong limbs to facilitate the other different momentums, different forces? How could that possibly be? So marking is performing an imperfect model of the real phrase. It's like a sketch or an abstraction of some sort. They are attending in discussion, they verified, attending to some specific aspects of the movement, and they often practice the real phrases by marking. Dancers have 2 hours, professional dancers like this, of which there were 800 tried out for 10 spots, highly professional dancers from all around the world. They, super experts, they come out, for the first 2 hours they have exercises and warm-ups, which might very well be 2 hours of Pilates. Then they rush off for 15 or 30 minutes, smoke a cigarette, and eat something horrible. And then they come back, the choreographer comes in, and now they're going to be working until 5 o'clock or 5:30 for another 4 or 5 hours dancing. It's impossible, no matter how fit you are, to continue at that level of effort. And it's not just physical effort, it's emotional effort all the time, giving of yourself. So you can't do that. But they still want to practice. Marking is a universal phenomenon. And I was shocked to find that there was no study of marking before mine. I went to the library at the La Bonne Conservatoire, which is a PhD granting institution of music and dance at Trinity La Bonne, and there was nothing in this large dance library and music library on marking. I mean, it was shocking. But if you look at it, of course, right? You can practice your tennis swings. People in the wings will practice cello like this. In staging, a production, it's called doing it in Italian or an Italian one-through, where you go to one side, and you rush through the different things to get the sense of what it will be like to stage it on this particular venue, the floor here, and with the furniture and stuff. And it's this imperfect modeling. So here's a case where they're using I can't tell whether that's a baseball bat or whether it's a bottle, but it might be a baseball bat. That's for tennis practicing to get the whole swing. When people are climbing, rock climbing, you will see them on the side doing this. It's a kind of planning. When they're going down moguls, they go at the top. If it's serious like this, they'll go at the top and they'll move it down like that. All of that is a kind of marking.
So
in this case,
there's the shape of the phrase, there's the mood, there's the color, there's that infinite number of bow speeds, and then there's what the vibrato is doing along with all of that to help support and help create mood. That's what interpretation.
So here's a cellist speaking about the different aspects that you might practice if you're going to be working on a piece of music. All of these are different aspects to work on. And you might think of it as like sketching. You could sketch in many different ways. Here was the, say this was the full thing. Well, these are going to be the elements that you might think are problematic, so you're going to forget about the other stuff. You're going to fixate on that. You might do it small like this, just work on little bits. And then on a small version before you're going to do the real painting or picture. And you could stylize it. You could small stylize it. You could do all sorts of things. If you look in painting, painters often will sketch what they're going to paint beforehand. And not only will they sketch it, but they'll have many studies of different aspects. Some painters will do the coloration. They will do the path. They will do sketching of the structures, and they can layer the whole thing before they make the whole thing. Here is now what I did. So I had some of the dancers come, and I said, please show me a full dance phrase. Now they dance usually with music, but not to music. They don't need the music in any respect to have perfect timing. So they can always do their movements without any sound. I ask them, just think of one and do one. It's a little old. There's a lot of gurning in it, a kind of gnashing of. It's not necessarily what you might think of as attractive, but it's a kind of interesting movements. And Wayne McGregor often tries to get lots of interesting movements, many that have never been done before by humans. So that was the full-out movement. Now I said, okay, Antoine, please would you mark it for me, large mark it. So in large marking, they will often have the full extension, but in this case, he had a foot movement, and he doesn't do more than this much in the foot movement before he had the foot go all the way up.
How come you made the sounds now when you marked it? Didn't make sounds before when you did it for real? Were you thinking it through?
Yeah, I'm kind of seeing it as I go.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's also maybe, it's not rhythm. It's not to get a rhythm, it's just it's like a help.
Okay, so the marking is helping. And he's thinking something. He's not just moving. There's plenty going on his head. Now I asked him, okay, with small market, that he just kicked his leg. What he just did was the equivalent of kicking his leg. He just went like that. Same movements, but this is small marking. How could this possibly facilitate? All right.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Now she's very balletic. She's a ballet dancer. So they have a lot of conventionalized marking.
And the marking would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not using energy, but I'm thinking, what's my pathway?
All right. So in ballet, they'll go like this. The teacher will go like this. You can't go to a dance class as a little girl or a little boy and 4 years old without going in your first or second class to mark it. Everybody does it. So here's the whole thing. And there's a conventionalized. So they all know these gestures.
Mm-hmm.
So we made a little experiment to explore the value of marking. And we knew that you can facilitate performance by mental simulation. There's lots of evidence of that. what we wanted to know was whether marking was any better than mental simulation, or basically was it just mental simulation. I hope it's as good as mental simulation. And we wanted to compare that with full out. So we were going to do it in these three conditions. And the conjecture was full out will be better than marking, which will be better than mental simulation. Lying on the floor with your eyes closed. And the way we did it was we had the associate choreographer teach the dancers a 1-minute phrase in 10 minutes. So it would take anyone here 2 days or 4 days to learn that, but they'd learn it in 10 minutes. Then she evaluated them according to certain measures. Then they practiced it. Depending upon which group they were in, they practiced it under one of the conditions. Then we measured them again, and we looked for the delta. So we had 3 different cases, so there were 3 distinct phrases to learn. And if you started out in full out, in the next trial, you did it marking, and in the third trial, you did it mental simulation. If you started out marking, then you would do it lying on the floor, mental simulation, and then full out. So it was a Latin square design. And we measured along technicality, which is sort of getting, did you move all the little bits? The detail, the completeness of details are all the little bits. The precision of positions would be, it's supposed to be there. Did you move this is when they're doing it full to show us what they have learned. Do they get precise positions? The dynamics, which you don't study in marking, would be the speed and the force, the dynamics, the emotionality, and the timing would be the various positions, are they when they should be. And the results were that marking was better than full out. Nobody expected this. And in fact, simulation did, well, little negative. So simulation wasn't particularly good. Maybe they got tired. Maybe it was too long for them to sit and who knows. But that was a surprise. And then when we looked at them by dimension, what we found was that in memory, which is getting the detail, that was better. The technicality was the precision. The timing was better. And in the dynamics, it still facilitated surprisingly, but not as much as. So this is a real surprise. It was and if you take technicality, timing, and memory together, you also get good significance, but you can see some high significances around there. So marking is a kind of movement reduction system. So is gesture. So is whispering or sub-vocalizing. So is physical miming with objects. And it seems to facilitate, so maybe other movement reductions might facilitate thought too. How does it work? Well, the conjecture is that you have the whole phrase, so I'm going to mark part of it. These are the active parts. I have to move my arm if I were doing this, but this is the part I'm really interested in. And the suggestion is that you are projecting onto this external structure. The external structure anchors your projection, and in virtue of the elasticity of the body or the giving you a substructure to work with, you're going to get some benefit from that. So the body, it's an analog computation. It's going to complement whatever is going on inside and allow you, like a sentence completion or word completion, it's going to give you part. So we wanted to test the projection. And let's distinguish between projection, perception, and imagination. If we had a tic-tac-toe board and you're playing and you see it, that's perception. And perception is supposed to be seeing what's there. Projection is where you're augmenting a grid with what you put the X and O there that isn't really there. And imagination is making the whole thing up in your head. So we believe that mental projection is more powerful than mental imagery alone because of that notion of completion, that we can project beyond what we can readily imagine. Again, it's more powerful, and that it's because the external structure somehow helps us. So to explore that, we made a little experiment. We had a few conditions. The imagination condition, there's no external structure here to help, and we were going to play tic-tac-toe. In the projection condition, they get a grid, nothing else. That was an idiotic projection condition, which I thought that this would somehow save them, but why would they even need X and O if they want to just mark positions? But we had that condition. And now if I were doing the experiment, I would take this grid and put it at a bad angle so that it's equal in structure, but it's a bad one, and then send it off to the HCI people to show that it matters what kind of structures you give. There are good ones and bad ones, and it's not just the presence of structure. And so you can get mental augmentation in various ways. So we did a 3x3 experiment. That is a 3x3 tic-tac-toe game. Those are projection conditions, as the imagination conditions. And we trained them first so that they would call out the cells. So they're going to play the game by I go 1, you go 5, I go 9. Play the game like that. So they get a practice session, and we have these other conditions, as you just saw. The board remains the same over time under projection. So you can't call this offloading because there's no persistent structure outside to call it offloading to. So whatever's going on is going on. And we predicted that projection would be better than imagination and less good, of course, than we didn't even bother with the other. And overall, there was no improvement. Now, we did expect improvement, but there was no overall improvement, and this idiotic condition actually was a little bit better. So this was a tiny bit, nothing is significant here. When we looked at individual differences, and we also gave people a Vivek pretest, the vividness of visual imagery, we found that the people who were bad imagers, politely spoken, I don't mean they're bad, but the people who were less good at visual imagery, they did benefit a fair bit from the well, less is better, but they did benefit a fair bit. The people who were good didn't, and here we're just checking to see how it played out with imagination. We asked people, and a lot of people were actually much better on imagination alone. We want to know that. We did the Vivek, and I'm about to discuss that in a second. But the reason we thought that projection might not be better than imagination was because it's not a cost-free action. There are still going to be placement costs to know where to put the piece and to tie it down. It's not a free activity, even though it is giving you structure to put it onto. So do benefits ever overcome the anchoring costs? Well, so we thought, well, if we make the the imagery task hard enough, people will benefit. So we trained them on a 4x4 board. So now it's just as before, train them on the 4x4, calling out the numbers. And here, thank goodness, we did find that there was significant difference between the presence of the grid condition, and now the little x and O is showing itself to be what it truly is, a distractor, and significantly better than the imagination. So the table is worth the cost of coordination when it gets hard enough. When we looked more closely, and we now compared the bad visualizers to the good visualizers, the bad visualizers really got a big bump from they really weren't very good in the imagination condition, and this helped them a great deal. And the good visualizers got significant, but they weren't quite significant, this subpopulation. Jointly they're significant, but they're getting close to significant. So we assume if we would do the 5x5, they too would be significant if they could anyone could play the 5x5. It's pretty hard. So projection is a real process. It's distinct from, at least I believe, distinct from perception and imagination. As problems get harder, we can't easily imagine the answer. This is not always true. You know, you get these people who are really wonderful physicists, and they're working in their head. But in general, it's going to be harder. You like these external supports, so we create external supports to project onto and scaffold imagination. Claim 6. If we can think with our bodies, then we can think with things that we're highly practiced with. Our bodies we're very practiced with, and so maybe if we're practiced with other things, we can think with them. So let's look at some tools. So here we have a guy who is very, very practiced with this tool. Here are other people who are practiced with their tools. And the normal body representation, there is the peri-head space, peri-hand space, peri-personal space. And these spaces are coded in the brain because our estimate of distance around us visually is not as precise as our knowledge of distance in virtue of moving to it. So how do I know to be able to do this, just like that, to get my hand to do the right thing, that estimate of where it is, and visually, it gets coded by the body. So that's why there's associative cortex tying the encoding of space to the body. This is something neuroscientists, of course, love. And they took a macaque, took 3 weeks to train this macaque to begin to master and extend the neural representation of the hand to use the rake, to understand how to use the rake in front of it, to rake things in and understand where just how to do it. It's a long time. So here's the normal peripersonal space. Here's the extended peripersonal space. Humans too, but if you give me something, it doesn't take me long to get within a 1/16 or an eighth of an inch of that. It's a lot faster than a macaque. So here we have Yitzhak Perlman, and can he use his instrument as if it's his body? Can he mark with his instrument as if it's his body? Well, we believe they can. I know they practice with it like that. So without belaboring this issue, let's start with the assumption that experts can think with their instruments. Can they have the same thoughts without their instruments? So do they need the instrument to have those thoughts? Arguably, bodies are necessary for certain sorts of thoughts. For example, kinesthetic modeling or action perception, simulation. Perhaps having certain musical thoughts are possible only when you're playing. So why might an expert have the same thought without playing? Why might that be the case? Why might you think this? So here's a guy who walks around in his life as if his violin is in his hands. When he hears somebody, and look at the physicality of this. Performances are very physical, more and more as time goes on. People like that. His mirror neurons are going nuts. So super experts, such as Yitzhak Perlman, they ought to be able to simulate playing without an instrument in their hand because they internalize it just the way we can internalize speech without having to speak. We could call this instrument-mediated cognition, but the instrument-mediated cognition might be possible without the instrument. Just like linguistic-mediated cognition might be possible without, well, not without speech. I mean, without speech, but not without words, but without articulating the words outside. And his auditory perception is so expert that when he listens, surely it's as if he's playing. Now, there's plenty of neural support that observing is enough to trigger mirror neurons. It's called, depending upon whose research program you follow, motor resonance, mirror neuron, action observation network. And watching or listening stimulates a covert action. This is the way I like to think of it. So Jean Rau characterized motor activity as having two parts. A covert part, which would essentially be motor preparation ready to trigger it, and then the activation of the overt part, which is the moving of the muscle system. There's two parts, the covert and the overt part. And you could have the covert part without the overt part by suppressing it, like mu suppression. And so what we would say is the mirror neuron system is stimulating the covert part, and you're just not doing the overt part. So experts should be able to simulate playing in the covert dimension. I haven't time to explain that in terms of enactive perception. So you might think that. On the other hand, do mirror neurons simulate at a fine enough resolution? Just how complex is the mirror simulation? There's a lot of dimensions to performance. How many of those are really simulated? It's an empirical question, but listening is not the same as performing. Josh Miguel, again, with the physicality of it. I assure you, Yitzhak Perlman is not breaking into a sweat when he listens. So what do you get for breaking into a sweat? Well, the performer, unlike the Yitzhak Perlman sitting in the chair, doesn't have the responsibility. The performer has, unlike Yitzhak Perlman, has a responsibility. That's weighing on the performer. The performer at every moment is having to decide how to attack the note. Its mood, the emotionality. Those are components that are not exactly the same as having yourself play the piece without all this context of strategizing and thinking and feeling. So these concepts are at the idea that at this moment, how am I going to attack that? That's an ad hoc concept. It's situated, it's very embodied. And it's unavailable even to an expert observer because they're not in that context. This is a reason to think that the mirror neuron system is not enough. If the mirror neuron system isn't enough, then maybe we do need the tool in our hand to actually have those thoughts. So agents project a future that's conceptually and experimentally richer than the future projected by an observer. Conjecture, but I've argued for weakly. All right, simulation is a lower resolution than actual performing. So let's just say that the conjecture here is that with a violin in hand, musical engagement is mediated differently than in imagination and active listening. And anyway, music is a pretty weird thing because the structure that we're talking about doesn't exist until we make it. Strange thing. All right. Well, I'm not going to talk about how we can extend from musical instruments to objects around us, arbitrary objects, and think with arbitrary objects, but I'd like to draw some conclusions to stay on time. Sorry, not for you. So, one, some conclusions in summary, basically. Thinking is multimodal. We can think with our body and our kinesthetic system. We can think with bodies and things. We can think with eyes and hands. Not necessarily independently of anything else going on, but we are thinking with them as part of an extended system. It's highly perceptual, in the case of this visual probing and creating visual narratives, not necessarily projection yet, but visual narratives. And here's this kinesthetic probing and thinking about sizes. It usually involves projections. So a lot of things around are going to have projections. The inside and outside processes are tightly coupled when we're doing that sort of thing. They often involve physical or mental simulation. Not always, but often. Simulation and projection are hard. So interacting is part of that process to help it go. The create, project structure. We can have eye-hand mediated cognition, body-mediated cognition, tool-mediated cognition, external representation mediated cognition, the part I didn't talk about, and object mediated cognition, didn't talk about. And with the right structures and movements, we can push thought forward faster, is the conjecture. And why do I think that? That's how many slides I showed you. It's 49 minutes. Okay.